Welcome back to Cheddar Business. President Trump's phone call with the leader of Ukraine remains at the center of the House's impeachment inquiry. And now Ukraine is adopting its own laws regarding whistleblowers. Joining us now is Christopher Miller, correspondent for Buzzfeed News, who's in Ukraine. Christopher, it's so great to have you on the show. We appreciate your time today. What kind of changes have you seen on the ground in Ukraine since the House launched the inquiry, since this has been at the top of the agenda here for lawmakers?
Right. Well, the reaction on the Ukrainian side has been very, very different. So there hasn't been there haven't been many changes. This whistleblower law that was passed by the Ukrainian parliament today is more of a coincidence than anything else. It's something that had been discussed before the Trump impeachment scandal really erupted. And before this phone call and the whistleblower complaint was brought to light in Washington. So the timing, of course, though, is interesting, and Ukrainians are discussing what's playing out in Washington. However, the reaction has been very different, as I mentioned earlier. The Ukrainians have a lot of their own very serious issues that they're currently dealing with, not least of which is an active war zone in the eastern regions of the country. And, they view this as a very Washington scandal. They see their president and their country as having been sort of dragged into this.
Interesting. So, Christopher, to that end, it sounds like obviously the president of Ukraine has not suffered any backlash among those in his own country in the wake of this.
That's right. The president enjoys a huge approval rating. He saw his approval rating, I believe, take a very small hit over the last few days. But that was, again, not because of this impeachment scandal that's embroiling Washington, but actually his handling of a part of a peace deal to try to end the war with Russia in eastern Ukraine. He still enjoys around 70% approval rating here. That hasn't really changed a whole lot since his election. A vast majority of Ukrainians approve of him, and they view him as being more dragged into this as and not really playing a central role. The reaction actually to the phone call, that July 25th phone call with President Trump, was interesting. He being Zelensky, really only was criticized by Ukrainians for suggesting that the new prosecutor general would, quote, be 100% his person. Otherwise, the Ukrainians here really believed that the pandering to Trump that we saw on Zelensky's part in this call was just a president who is very well aware of the fact that the country leans heavily on the U.S. for military aid and financial assistance. This was just what many Ukrainians expected their president to actually to be saying.
Well, take us through the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine and how it's not only changed perhaps over the last month, but during the Trump administration, given the president's seeming affinity for Vladimir Putin.
Right. Ukrainians were really fearful of a President Trump. And there were many here, including politicians, who did express openly their desire to see Hillary Clinton win the 2016 presidential election. One funny thing that happened immediately after the 2016 election and Trump's victory was a lot of politicians going onto their Facebook pages and wiping them clean of criticisms of Trump. And Ukrainians were worried about exactly what this would mean and how U.S. policy would change under Trump. But they were pleasantly surprised, actually, that the policy more or less didn't change. And in fact, the Trump administration approved lethal aid for Ukraine in the form of Javelin anti-tank missiles, which were delivered in April 2018. And this was something that the Obama administration hadn't approved. And so they being the Ukrainians, have until recently been a little bit cautious of the Trump presidency, but more or less fine with it. It's now only.
In terms of the relationship moving forward, right, between President Zelensky and President Trump. In some ways, it seems like President Zelensky may have been able to capitalize on this at home. Do you anticipate that the two might work closer together in the future?
Possibly. President Zelensky is still really hoping for that very important White House meeting with Trump. This is something that the Ukrainians believe is necessary to show, kind of once and for all, that Trump is not going to drastically shift U.S. policy on Ukraine, that he will continue to support Ukraine even throughout this conflict with Russia and its separatist proxies in eastern Ukraine. Right now, there's no meeting on the books, and the presidential administration here and members of President Zelensky's party have told me that these talks with the U.S. are ongoing, that they are concerned that there is no date on the books for a White House meeting yet, and they're concerned that this impeachment inquiry could actually hold that up even further at a time when the Ukrainians are really pushing for a peace deal with Russia to end the conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Christopher, I just want to end with getting a whole picture of sentiment there. Given that Ukraine is at the center of the impeachment inquiry, in terms of the way the Democrats are thinking about it, how is this story playing out in the papers in the Ukraine? How are people talking about it there? Is it something that is on the mind of normal, everyday people the same way it is on the mind of people here in the U.S.?
Not at all. It's very different. Most of the reporting here is aggregated from Western media. It's more or less the Cliff Notes version of what is playing out in Washington. There's very little original reporting over here, and a lot of the opinion pieces and columns that we see are more about this concern over a possible shift in policy. And civil society over here and ordinary Ukrainians are more concerned about putting food on the table, about the conflict that is ongoing in eastern Ukraine, about Zelensky's push for peace with Russia and solution to ending this conflict. And they're watching in interest with what's happening in Washington, because the president has been a part of this in the sense that some of the leverage that Trump was holding over a president happened to be the president of Ukraine. And of course, there's this phone call, and all of this is at the center of the whistleblower complaint. Ukrainians, generally speaking, are interested in it, but they have bigger problems on their mind.
Yeah.
All right, Christopher Miller, correspondent for Buzzfeed News on the ground in Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.